Speaker, America's economy is struggling, and despite all the spending and promises out of Washington, a lot of average Americans, more than 15 million, are wondering where are the jobs because they don't have one. This Democrat Congress and this White House promised a lot to these workers and to the American taxpayer. If they would just give them a blank check, if they could just write money like there was no tomorrow, that they, Washington, would know best how to get this economy back on track. Unfortunately, the reality of the past 16 months since the stimulus bill passed has unfortunately been much less than what was promised. The Obama administration likes to tout. Right now they call this the summer of recovery, but what you don't see them touting is what their original promises were for that $862 billion stimulus, more than $1 trillion when you add the interest to it. The taxpayers will actually have to pay back. The reality is that the Obama administration, Democrats in Washington, failed on all three key promises to the American public about the economy. They said our first promise is if you'll pass this stimulus, the unemployment rate would remain below 8%. They said non-farm payroll employment, that's most workers, would increase to 137.6 million by the end of this year. And then finally they said if you pass our stimulus bill, 90% of the payroll jobs created would be in the private sector. Well, let's look at the reality. It's been 16 months. A lot of the stimulus has been spent, not all, but a lot of it. So 16 months later, what do we see? Obama forecast was supposed to be, at this point, almost 7.5%. Today, it's actually 9.5%. That's a little lower than the spend, and the reason it's lower, 650,000 Americans last month just gave up looking for work, gave up hope looking for work. So the unemployment rate went down not because the economy's getting better, but people have given up hope that they'll get a job 16 months after this magical stimulus bill was passed. So the actual versus the forecast is very sad. Second promise, that the stimulus would raise employment, jobs in America, 137 million. This is where we're at right here, as stagnant as can be. And in fact, right now, congressional Democrats in the White House, they are 7 million jobs short of where they promised they would be by the end of the year. 7 million jobs short. The economy has never created 7 million jobs in 6 months before. Short on promise number 2, failed by a wide margin. And here, I think, is the reason. I think this sums up why the stimulus failed, why so many Americans are disappointed with the Obama administration, why I think the last poll was 13% of Americans believe the stimulus helped them in any way. 90% of Americans believe this economy is in bad shape, and almost 3/4 don't believe it's going to get better anytime soon. So much for restoring consumer confidence in America's economy, and this is the real reason why. Promise number 3. Remember, promise number 1, below 8%, didn't come close. Promise number 2, we'd have 137 million jobs by the end of this year, 7 million short. This is promise number 3, that 90% of all the new jobs created by the stimulus would come from the private sector, not from government. They'd come from small businesses back home along Main Street, the same small businesses and private sector jobs that have always brought America out of a steep recession. Well, here's the actuality. Since the stimulus passed 16 months ago, hundreds of billions of dollars of money spent and wasted in America. Guess what's happened? The only sector that's grown, the federal government. Federal government's added 400,000 government workers. Now, how about the private sector? How about our small businesses in every state across America? Have lost almost 3.3 million jobs. Federal government workers grew. State government came down a little, but they pumped a lot of stimulus money into more government workers. But private sector, the businesses that bring us out of the recession, lost 3.3 million jobs. That's why this economy is so subpar. That's why America is blessed. We are, I think, genetically predisposed to bouncing back from tough economic times. We hate to be in recession, but not this time. This recession, unfortunately, is continuing, not from a statistical sense, but from a jobs sense. It is 1/3 as strong a recovery as the Reagan recovery. I'm going to talk about that in a minute. But here's the reason why. Washington has poured all this money into government workers, wasteful stimulus spending, and they expect the economy to just jumpstart, as they said. It'll jumpstart and consumer confidence will grow. The opposite has happened. Consumers, families are holding on to their money. They're frightened by the dangerous levels of debt in this country. They're frightened by $13 trillion of national debt America owes in publicly held debt. And businesses are frightened these days. They're frightened not by what, as one of the secretaries of labor here in Washington said, businesses aren't adding jobs because they're waiting to see what government can do for them. Businesses aren't adding jobs because they're frightened by what government will do to them. They see an environment in Washington, proposals that dramatically increase taxes, increase regulation, increase their health care costs, increase their energy costs, that broaden government, expand regulation into almost every nook and cranny of this economy. And they look at that and they say, no, we're going to delay rehiring people we laid off, hiring new ones. We're going to delay that critical investment decision, that expansion decision, the decision to buy that new piece of equipment, because we don't want to be punished by Washington for adding jobs. We don't want to be punished if we go out and hire that new worker, buy that new piece of equipment. And that uncertainty, unfortunately, is an anchor around our economic recession, and that uncertainty means that American businesses are holding on to almost $2 trillion of cash. $2 trillion. Normally enough to, again, start bringing us out of this recession. They're not willing to do that. They're frightened by this White House. They're frightened by Washington, D.C. They look at what's happening in Congress and these wild proposals, extreme ideologically driven agendas. And they say, we're going to play it safe. We're going to stand pat with our money. Consumers are doing it because of the debt. Businesses because of these terrible anti-business, anti-job, growth-killing proposals coming out of Washington, D.C. We've seen this before. Economists refer to this phenomenon as regime uncertainty. What I would call it is rational expectations. Families know America's so deep in debt, someone's got to pay it back. You can't tax the wealthy just to pay that back. You could double tax everyone's taxes in America. Double them this year, we'd still be running a deficit. You can't tax your way out of this problem. But businesses, families are worried that's exactly what's going to happen. Middle class, small businesses will end up shouldering a bigger and bigger burden of government. It means less money in the paycheck. They know that. Rationally, they expect it. So they're holding back. Businesses are doing the same. We saw this before as President Franklin Roosevelt's contradictory and rapidly shifting economic policies delayed the recovery from the Great Depression. The Great Depression. The U.S. was the last country to recover from the Great Depression. Today, unfortunately, this White House, this Washington, is following the same formula of spending, of uncertainty, of poor governance, poor decisions, and at times, as we saw in the Gulf, sheer incompetence. But again, businesses look at what they see out of the White House, higher taxes, new laws, entrepreneurs who are frightened to hire. And that's why, back to this chart, that's why the federal government is the only sector that's grown. And whenever there are government jobs, they only last as long as that money keeps coming out of your paycheck. But in the private sector, when a business creates a job, when a local company hires a worker, buys that new piece of manufacturing equipment, those economic benefits multiply across the community. But unfortunately, private sector in America lost over 3 million jobs. Don't take my word for it. The National Federation of Independent Businesses recently surveyed a number of their small business owners. Here's what they said. The U.S. economy faces hurricane-force headwinds, And the government is at the center of the storm, making an economic recovery very difficult. This is small businesses. And by the way, I'm Congressman Kevin Brady. I represent the 8th District of Texas. It is a great area, 11 counties from Louisiana border through East Texas and down to through Montgomery County and the Woodlands. I'm the 4th senior Republican on the Ways and Means Committee, the ranking Republican on Trade Subcommittee, and the ranking House Republican on the Joint Economic Committee. So we've been studying these businesses and these economic numbers for some time. And what the NFIB, the Small Business Independent Businesses, said, in addition, either policymakers have no idea how to help the economy or they are intentionally committing it to unsustainable expenditure growth and deficits so large there'll be no alternative but to raise taxes, a slow suicide for a dynamic economy. Just what I said. The National Federation of Independent Businesses confirmed that it is the hurricane force winds coming out of Washington, D.C. that's holding this economy back. They go on to say this: with an unemployment rate of nearly 10%, the president travels the country touting the health care bill that few like, selling wealth redistribution and the need for more taxes. What should ordinary citizens and small business owners expect from all this? A growing and more dynamic economy? Not likely. Taxing success is a terrible path to growth and real investment. And adding to the misery and pessimism, massive government deficits threaten future capital availability for the private sector. So our independent businesses along Main Street say just what those of us who have been in business before say. It is Washington that's holding back this economic recovery. It's the White House that's holding back this economic recovery with this very extreme agenda. And before I'm going to yield in a moment to another Texan who serves one of our more, I think, studious members, the Joint Economic Committee from Texas, Dr. Michael Burgess, I want to take this quote from the Business Roundtable because while the NFIB represents just tens of thousands of independent businesses, Business Roundtable represents businesses from every sector in America who are selling here in the United States, competing around the world to sell American as well. And here's what the Business Roundtable just said. Many regulations and legislation, both existing and proposed, exacerbate the uncertainty created by today's volatile economic environment. Virtually every new regulation has an impact on recovery, competitiveness, and job creation. Often, that impact is negative. On an individual basis, most businesses can cope with each new regulation, but the collective impact on the economy is enormous and often harmful. And with a massive new health care law, this is from the Business Roundtable, with a massive new health care law, financial reform legislation looming, companies are more worried than ever about the impact new regulations and legislation will have on their operations and their bottom line. Not knowing what to expect from these pending regulations, businesses are acting cautiously to forestall any negative impact. These actions are squelching economic growth and job creation as companies are forced to freeze investment and hiring until they understand how they will be affected by these new mandates. So, despite hundreds of billions of dollars of spending, all this government intervention and expansion of government, the American economy is stalled because businesses, those job creators who bring us out of the recession, are frightened by Washington and these policies. They don't want to be punished. They're holding on to almost $2 trillion of cash, and that capital is what would fuel our economic recovery. So Washington and the White House is the single largest obstacle to America getting back on its economic feet. And joining me tonight is a congressman from Texas, serves on the Energy and Commerce Committee, one of the leading Republicans there, but also serves with me on the Joint Economic Committee. Focuses not just on health care, but on businesses along Main Street. And I would yield to the honorable congressman from Texas in the Fort Worth area, Dr. Michael Burgess.
Well, I thank the gentleman for yielding. And, of course, the gentleman is correct. You know, I believe in the American economy. I believe in the ability of American people to recover this economy. I don't think that the United States House of Representatives, the Senate, and the White House combined can keep this economy down forever, but they can give it a good shot at keeping it down longer than it needs to be. And we all know, because of the prolonged effect of joblessness, the economy is having a tougher time recovering. And the gentleman said it so well. The reason that small and medium-sized business is reluctant to add a job right now, and I know you see the same thing in your district that I'm seeing in my district. Some things look like they're picking up a little bit. Parking lots are a little fuller. But when you talk to the small business person and ask them, are you doing a little bit better this year? Yeah, maybe a little bit. Do you think you might add a job soon? Might you be able to take someone else on to your business? Well, I might, but I don't know what you're going to do to me in this health care bill. I still haven't figured it out. I have no idea what this financial regulatory scheme that you've passed is going to do to me. I sure can't afford the tax increases that you're going to be delivering at the end of this year. So, no, I don't think I can add a job. And then if you further do something with energy prices, I know that the future is just too uncertain. So I'll just stand pat right now. I'm doing okay, but I'm not going to be adding any job. Well, that may be one or two jobs at a single business at a strip shopping center. But extrapolated across the larger economy, those are the jobs that should be fueling our recovery. And the activities here in Washington, D.C. are what is having the dampening effect on that. Now, today's Wall Street Journal had kind of an interesting lead editorial on the editorial page, appropriately titled Stimulating Unemployment. Kind of a novel approach to how you might attack a problem in the economy. According to the Wall Street Journal today, they talked about how the presidents typically invite Americans to appear at Rose Garden press conferences to trumpet a policy success. But yesterday, we saw what may have been a first. President Obama introduced 3 Americans, an auto worker, a fitness center employee, and a woman in real estate, who've been out of work so long that they underscore the failure of his entire economic program. Going on, they say, but Mr. Obama was nonetheless obliged to concede that 18 months after his $862 billion stimulus, there are still 5 job seekers for every job opening, and that 2.5 million Americans will soon run out of unemployment benefits. Only last week, Vice President Joe Biden was hailing the stimulus for saving or creating 3 million jobs. This week, the White House says, we need even more stimulus in the form of jobless checks to make up for the jobs his original stimulus spending did not create. And here's an interesting issue. Of course, we hear over and over and over again how it is the Republicans that are obstructing the extension of unemployment insurance benefits, but realistically, there is still money left in that stimulus bill. Since the stimulus has been such a failure in creating jobs and the money is available to pay for those unemployment benefits, that seems like a reasonable suggestion. And I get calls in the office all day long that, yeah, that is a reasonable suggestion. Why don't we proceed with that? But instead, we continue to pass bills where this money is just simply going to be added to the deficit. If the money wasn't just sitting there languishing in the stimulus bill, then maybe you could see their point. But realistically, the money is there. It should be used to offset the extension of unemployment benefits. Because one thing that we do know, there is a consequence for borrowing these vast sums of money. And we know that expanding the deficit to the $1.4 or $1.6 trillion that we're going to see this year is ultimately money which is going to have to be borrowed. And because that money will ultimately have to be borrowed, it could raise the interest rate and subsequently have an effect on inflation. So why not do the sensible thing and spend the money that you have already allocated in the stimulus bill, which isn't doing anyone any good anyway? If you need to extend unemployment insurance, that would be the correct place to do it. I have some other points that I'd like to share, but I'll yield back to the gentleman and hear his thoughts on that.
Well, I'd like to follow up on your point about unemployment benefits. The Republicans support helping people when they're down on the luck, no question about it. There's been extension after extension. Our point and our principle in this whole issue has been, don't make matters worse for people by adding to the debt, by adding to the uncertainty about the economy, by frightening more consumers into saving more of their money. Pay for this bill. And our point was, you've barely, White House, congressional Democrats, you haven't even spent 1/2 of that stimulus money yet. Some of it's been allocated, but you still have nearly half of it left. Rather than waste it on what you've wasted on, I want to talk for a second about some of those, or creating just government jobs. Why don't we pay for the unemployment benefits with that money? And let's start to stimulating private sector jobs, which again, we've lost more than 3 million since the stimulus took effect. And Dr. Burgess, people say back home, they look at some of the wildly exaggerated claims from the stimulus. Remember all the phantom congressional districts that this White House actually made up districts that don't exist today and credited them with certain job creation. Some of the examples of job creation were just wild. $1 million for each pair of boots that created jobs, just crazy. But looking at some of them, stimulus money, $71,000, University of Wake Forest, in taxpayer funds to study the effects of cocaine addiction on monkeys. University of New York at Buffalo received $390,000 in stimulus to conduct a study on the relationship between drinking malt liquor, beer, and using marijuana. 100 people were paid $45 a day, or will be paid $45 a day for 3 weeks by taxpayers to drink malt liquor. Compare it with marijuana. Arizona State University, half a $1,000,000 to study the genetic difference between queen and worker ants. $3 million for a turtle crossing in Florida. $50,000 for a hand puppet grant in the Midwest. Bloomington, Indiana, $40,000 for 10 solar-powered trash compactors, which reminds me of that New York city that received stimulus funds. And they said, well, we didn't, for a homeless program. They said, well, we didn't ask for this money. We don't have a homeless problem. And the response from Washington was, well, get creative. I don't know if that means get creative creating homeless people to use the grant for. But on the stimulus dollars, Florida, for example, used $8 million of their funds to pay off a backlog of people who had already completed work for the state. So they used it to pay their bills, creating zero net jobs. National Science Foundation gave funding to North Carolina University for a dance draw, which involves students attaching wireless mice to their chests and wrists and dancing to form abstract geometric shapes on a computer. So when the president stands at the White House and says we need help for the unemployed, Republicans agree. We want to stop wasting stimulus money, help people who actually need help, stop playing politics with them. Is money for mice and studying malt liquor, beer, and hand puppets more important than helping people down on their luck? We don't think so. We also don't think adding to this terrible deficit and making it tougher for consumers to have confidence in their country again helps either. And I just wanted to expand on that point because I think it's a critical one for people watching tonight who really are wondering if Congress is functioning at all or listening at all. I honestly don't think this Congress is. I'd yield back to you, Dr. Burgess.
Well, and I was just going to make the point. The Wall Street Journal editorial today talks about the 5 applicants for every job that is available. And we had in our committee today on Energy and Commerce, we had yet another hearing on the oil spill down in the Gulf of Mexico. And once again, it came up about the issue of the Secretary of Interior proposing a moratorium on drilling in the Gulf of Mexico. Well, here we kind of reverse the situation. Here we can kill 5 jobs for the price of 1. For every job that we destroy on the drilling rigs in the Gulf of Mexico, 5 jobs in that are also directly related to that activity in the Gulf, 5 jobs are lost. So the moratorium in the Gulf of Mexico, in a very real way, is going to affect families all up and down the Gulf, families that have already been hurt by this spill, already been hurt by the fact that the federal government did not exercise its due diligence and oversight in leasing that well to BP in the first place. BP, a foreign oil company that has one of the worst records as far as safety, to be able to drill a well like this with all kinds of passes and waves on all of the NEPA regulations, wasn't required to put out a spill plan before they did this drilling. Well, now the poor people in the Gulf they've lost their shrimping, they've lost their fishing, they've lost their tourism, and now they're going to lose what's left of their economy because of the imposition of this moratorium at a time when we should be tasked with creating jobs, when we should be getting out of the way of the private sector and let the productive sector of the American society do what it does best, and that's grow and prosper and create jobs. Instead, we're putting additional impediments up there that are going to make it even more difficult for an area of the United States that's been hard hit by hurricanes and now hard hit by this Gulf oil spill. And we're all grateful that the spill appears to be contained at the present time, but we all know this is not over. The cleanup is not over. The well is not yet shut in. They're facing some tough problems down there, and then we add to the problem by a moratorium that's ill-advised. The president's own panel said there's no reason to do this, and yet the Secretary of the Interior just pushes ahead and would not even provide us today with any of the data that was used, any of the risk data that was used to say that there must be a moratorium, or any of the economic data that was available to him and presumably to the president about what the effects of this moratorium would be. So here we are in the face of the worst recession. We got an area of the country that's really hurting, and let's see if we can't hurt them a little worse. It just makes no sense. I'll yield back to the gentleman from Texas.
Well, you raise great points. I'd like to follow it up. I don't think this White House or Washington has a clue as to how damaging this drilling moratorium has on just average American workers who are tied not just to the Gulf, but energy production offshore that spreads out. I saw a study the other day, all 50 states, nearly every congressional district risks job losses as a result of this drilling moratorium. We're already seeing companies who are redeploying their rigs to Egypt, moving their investment out of the United States, Brazil, West Africa, the Middle East, and those rigs won't be coming back anytime soon. Typical rig in the Gulf in deep water has 1,500 workers tied to it, 1,000 or more vendors. When they leave the Gulf, they don't come back for years. So we already have businesses laying off workers, moving equipment, infrastructure outside the United States, already cutting their capital budget for future investment in the United States. And it doesn't take long before you have our energy infrastructure and headquarters leaving the United States as well. There are literally tens of thousands of workers tied directly to the Gulf, more than 170,000 at immediate risk of this. And yet, two thoughts. One, Monday, the president was in front of the White House talking about playing politics with people's jobs. Playing politics with people's jobs. That's exactly what his drilling moratorium is doing along the Gulf of Mexico. And I found it frustrating today. I picked up or actually went online, read the Houston Chronicle, and there it said the president is coming down to Texas, to Houston, August 9th to raise money for his party. And I read that realizing that we've had a standing invitation by letter to the president asking him to come down to Houston to meet face-to-face with these energy workers, the ones whose jobs he is killing right now, and explain to them his reasoning. Listen to these American workers, Democrat, Republican, Independent, it doesn't matter. They're all ages, all ethnic categories, all income categories. They just want to work, and his moratorium is destroying their livelihood. We are still waiting for an answer for that invitation, but apparently he doesn't have time to talk to our workers or to sit down face-to-face with them because he's got to raise campaign cash. So we said today, Mr. President, can you give us an hour to meet with these workers? Can you give us 15 minutes? Do you have time at all for workers in Texas and along the Gulf who now they see their hopes of their small business, of putting their kids through college, of keeping their home dashed because of a poorly thought out drilling moratorium that is taking an environmental disaster in the Gulf and creating an economic disaster for a lot of innocent families who had nothing to do with that spill. And I know you sense that in Dallas-Fort Worth, as one business from Dallas told me. Said, what small business can survive without 6 months of revenue? It's a great question because the answer is not many. Not many at all. Maybe the big guys can, but they're going to be laying people off. They're not going to be buying from vendors. The damage is going to be wholesale. With that, I know you feel that pain in Dallas-Fort Worth, and I guess we're just frustrated that I am at least, that the president won't at least listen to reason, come down and face our energy workers, at least just have the courage to sit down with them. Give us an hour out of your busy campaign fundraising and tell them your reasoning. And I would yield to you, Dr. Burgess.
Well, and it does get to your point of playing politics with people's jobs. I just want to say a couple of other things about the predominant Democratic agenda items that have been pushed through this House of Representatives, largely well, in fact, almost entirely on party line votes. In fact, the only thing that has been bipartisan about these bills has been the opposition, the health care bill, financial regulatory bill, cap and trade, probably more Democratic votes against, and made it a truly bipartisan opposition, and very few Republican votes in favor. But Vice President Biden over the weekend, in talking on an interview with on one of the Sunday shows, said, look, these are gigantic packages to deal with the problem we inherited. The vast majority of the American people, and a lot of people really involved, don't even know what's inside the packages. I assume he's talking about people involved in like conference committees and people involved in congressional committees who actually wrote this legislation. Going back to quote then, people don't know a lot of what's going on in the Recovery Act, understandably, because this has been so much stuff that's been flowing our way. Well, Mr. Vice President, with all due respect, this is the problem. Because people don't know what's in this stuff, because no one bothered to take the time to bring along even public opinion while this stuff was done, as a consequence, you've got people who are fearful of what is contained within this health care bill. We're now 3 months into it. The rules and regulations are being written in secret by the Department of Health and Human Services and this new CMS, Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services Director, that nobody knows, the most important man in the country that no one ever heard of, Donald Berwick. It's no wonder that people are of necessity concerned. They're concerned for their own survival because they don't know what the implications are for these big things that we've already passed. And yes, Mr. Vice President, people are confused by the stimulus bill because, as Mr. Brady pointed out, there's so much stuff in there that was absolutely unnecessary, had nothing to do with stimulating the economy. I remember one morning in our Joint Economic Committee where it was revealed that there was so many jobs created in Arizona's 9th Congressional District. Well, that was news to everyone because Arizona's 9th Congressional District hasn't even been created yet. It may in the reapportionment after the census, but right now it doesn't exist. They stop at number 8. So is it any wonder that people have lost faith with their government's ability to do the things necessary to help this economy recover? It has been certainly been educational to sit on that Joint Economic Committee, to hear the testimony like we heard last week, all of the happy talk coming from the administration that things are great, it's the recovery summer. I don't think so. Have you been out beyond the confines of Washington, D.C. to look what's happening to real people and real people's lives? I know the gentleman has a number of facts and charts that he wants to share with us, so I'll leave it to him at this point. But I did want to come and share with you some of the thoughts I had on this very important topic that I'm so grateful that you brought up tonight.
Well, I thank you, Congressman Burgess, for joining us tonight and for your work on trying to get the economy going. And you are so right. This recovery is so subpar. Most Americans don't realize it. I've talked earlier about Americans we are predisposed, excited about bouncing out of recessions as fast as we can, but not this time. We took a look at the recessions the country has gone through since the Great Depression, and the one that's closest to it, that had the most damage, happened in the early 1980s. And if you compare how the President Obama's performance is today versus President Reagan's in 1982 and 1983, it's pretty stunning. The Reagan recovery, which had a higher unemployment rate to begin with, it is if you look at 3 key areas, in the first 3 quarters after the recession ended under President Reagan, his economy grew twice as fast as the Obama recovery. If you look at the number of jobs created, it isn't even close. The first year of the Reagan recovery, the United States added 3 million jobs. We've actually lost them under President Obama. And look at this chart. You can see what the job numbers are. Reagan continues to increase. The Obama, even under the best scenario right now, It is a very slow, subpar, very stagnant type of economic recovery. And then similarly, the unemployment rate fell by more than 2 points under President Reagan, while it's increased under President Obama. And you asked, what is the difference? What is the difference? And is what Congressman Brady just talked about, two things. President Obama decided Washington would create jobs. Washington knew best. They didn't put an economic stimulus together. They put a political stimulus together. And what it's produced is government jobs and no economic recovery. It's also balanced with higher tax offset, higher tax increases, higher energy costs, the fear of new health care costs, new regulations, taxes everywhere. So job creators aren't adding jobs. The Reagan recovery is just the opposite. He created certainty for this country. They lowered taxes. They spurred investment. They told businesses, if you create jobs, you can keep them. You won't be punished, you'll be rewarded. And what did the private sector do? It created jobs. Created jobs in America. Now, what we're facing is a country at a time we have 15 million workers, almost 15 million workers looking for jobs. Many of them, who almost half have been out of work for more than 6 months. That's the longest since they started keeping numbers. Those with high school education struggle with, gosh, it's almost 17% unemployment. Certain ethnic categories have much higher unemployment rates than others. And it's because this president and this Congress, when faced with the choice between lowering taxes and creating small business jobs, or spending, raising taxes, and creating government jobs, they chose the latter. And so America's recovery has stalled. It is subpar, offers little hope to most people, certainly hasn't, as the president claimed, jump-started the economy or restored consumer confidence, just the opposite. When we talk about taxes, we talked earlier about families so worried about this debt that this country has gone, just a staggering amount of debt under President Obama. In fact, when Republicans lost control of Congress, the annual debt to that year was about $160 million. Too high, in my view, and I think too high in most Americans' view. Now, within 3 years, that debt is almost 8 times, almost 9 times higher, at $1.4 trillion. The Republicans' debts of a year are now the Democrat debts of a month. Each and every month, we're adding that equivalent. Now, and debt has exploded. And the cost, a great example, right now America's debt is more than 60% of the size of our economy. That's in the yellow warning category. If we continue to move this direction, we'll be at 100% of the economy by the end of this decade, and it will skyrocket to an incredible, almost 10 times the size of our entire economy. Everything we make and produce in America by the year 2084, if we stay on this path. And that debt has real cost. It means we have a bigger government for families and workers to drag around on their back. Younger people will pay more out of their paycheck to drag this economy around. It creates an anchor on America's prosperity. In fact, most economists tell us that when a country's debt gets to about 90% of the size of their economy, of everything that they produce and create, when the debt gets to 90%, it drags down your economy substantially by about 1 percentage point. What that means, that doesn't sound like a lot, but what that means is instead of America growing at 3% a year, good, steady, strong 3% a year, we grow at a more anemic 2% a year. So you really lose a third of your economic prosperity. It puts you in the category of Europe, which has had this big government mentality. They've had this anchor around their economy, and it's cost them. I took a look at the 5 most troubled countries in Europe. We've all been following Greece's problem with their debt, but also what they call the PIGS, and it stands really for Portugal, Italy, Ireland, Greece, and Spain, the 5 most troubled European countries. You look at their gross debt, the United States is right in the middle of them, of the 5 most troubled countries in Europe. If you look at our budget deficit as a percent of our economy, the United States ranks 3rd worst as well. Third worst in gross debt, third worst in budget deficit, and we are, on a bullet, headed their direction. Now, we're not necessarily in the same shape as Greece today, but we're on the trajectory. We're on the path. That's why we need to focus on education in America, make sure people can say these things. We're on the path to a calamity financially unless we change our ways. And one thing I want to point to that Congressman Brady talked about people knowing taxes are coming. What's frightened a lot of job creators, and I think a lot of just average families in America, certainly in Texas, in southeast Texas and East Texas that I represent, families tell me spending's out of control, and it scares them. Small businesses, they look at all these programs that House Democrats try to pass each week, and they say, look, that won't create jobs or customers. That just frightens people more. And they know they're going to end up being taxed for it. And you look at, there's taxes, proposed increased taxes on health care, Cadillac health care plans, on income for Americans, on capital gains, on dividends, on death taxes. There's all the private health insurance plans, pharmaceutical, medical device taxes, the cap and trade legislation, which is just a tax on all the energy used at your home and in your vehicle. They're talking now about a VAT tax, a value-added tax, which would come on top of what we have today. A value-added tax, which has worked in European countries, added on top of everything we had. It's the politician's perfect tax. It's an ideal tax. It's hidden from the public. It sounds small, and people pay for it in everything they buy. It's hidden. It's a hidden tax. Politicians can play with it any way they choose, and the public rarely knows. And people look at that and they think the Bush tax cuts, which was so helpful for our economy and our middle class, for an average Texas family, would have to pay $3,000 more a year if those tax cuts go away. $3,000 more every year. I know in Washington that doesn't sound like a big deal, but for most families across America, that's a lot of money, especially right now. That's all their utility bills for the year. Probably throw in a cable bill as well. I took a look at a study I saw the other day about how out of control spending burdens our youth. We all know how much our debt has increased over the last 3 years since Democrats took control of Congress. But just look at two things. Just look at the impact of the 2008 and 2009 bailouts and stimulus. According to economist Dr. Ed Stringham of Trinity College, just the cost from those two events will cost the average 22-year-old coming out of college this year $145,000 over their working life. That's $280 a month, equivalent of a second car payment. That's the impact spending has on people. And that's just two spending bills. That's not the $1.5 trillion of debt from the last year and the year before that continue to pile up. And again, we're $13 trillion of spending and getting higher. I'd point out, too, people like to, I know the excuse in Washington is it's Bush's fault. Everything is Bush's fault. America's not going all the way in the World Cup was Bush's fault, I think some people believe in Washington. But if you look at where the jobs were created in America, you can see here is when Republicans fully controlled Congress and added, during their tenure, 6.6 million jobs. Since Speaker Pelosi took the gavel, what we've seen is a loss of over 6 million jobs. So almost every job Republicans created, Democrats have destroyed. And the reason that's going to get even worse is because this White House and this Congress is the most job-killing, anti-business, anti-growth Congress perhaps in the history of the United States. And we see this not just in tax increases and cap and trade and health care costs, but wild provisions coming out of the House, and now, of course, the drilling moratorium that is beginning to destroy jobs and lives and small businesses in the Gulf of Mexico. And what's, I guess, perhaps most saddening is that along the Gulf Coast, many families in Louisiana and Arkansas and Mississippi who are bearing the brunt of BP's oil spill and bearing the brunt of this administration's failure to contain the spill. They're the ones who are begging this president not to continue this drilling moratorium, allow our workers to go back to work, because they know, as bad as environmental damage has been, the drilling moratorium's damage on their jobs and livelihood will add even more misery to their lives. We can't allow that to happen. Mr. President, I'd ask you again, come down to Houston, meet with our energy workers, see whose lives and jobs you're destroying, meet with our independent businesses, meet with our mid-sized businesses, meet with the companies that are out there in the Gulf today wanting to go back to work, who don't want their rigs to go to other countries, who don't want the jobs to go to other countries, the equipment to go to other countries, our capital to go to other countries, and eventually our energy infrastructure to go around the rest of the world to the detriment of U.S. energy workers in America. Mr. President, while you're fundraising in Houston, give us an hour to meet with our workers. Give us 15 minutes if you're so busy fundraising and can't spare the time for our workers. Just sit down with them. We won't have press there. There'll be, you pick the workers if you choose. Although if I were you, I would ask average Americans who are facing their jobs so you could listen outside the Beltway, so you don't, no teleprompters, no big speeches. Just listen to our energy workers, and perhaps you'll see just how damaging this drilling moratorium is and will be for America. What you'll hear is that they're already suffering and people are being laid off. Businesses are contemplating not being able to survive and filing bankruptcy. What you'll see is that energy prices will go up as a result of your moratorium, because the Gulf of Mexico produces so much of the energy we use in America. What you'll hear is that we are giving more power and more energy strength to countries outside the United States, some of whom can't stand anything that America stands for, and that we'll face an energy shortage in 2011, 2012 if this drilling moratorium continues. You'll hear from shallow well operators who have drilled, gosh, in the Gulf of Mexico, I think 50,000 wells without an incident. But now what they find is that they can't get a permit to continue working, so they're facing layoffs of their workers and their financial struggles. And the deep water, which has drilled 14,000 wells around the world safely, but for the BP incident, you'll see that one rig is already leaving for Egypt. Others are planning to leave and won't be back anytime soon. Years, perhaps, 1 year, 2 years, 3 years. In the meantime, what do our workers do? What do those small businesses do? What are the people who do manufacturing, who do oil field services and supplies throughout the country, who reach literally into every state in almost every congressional district in America? What do those businesses do? Mr. President, we're not asking much. We're asking you to help get this economy back on track. Take off the table the drilling moratorium. End it today. Take off the table cap and trade and the energy prices it will, high energy prices that it will create. Take off the table the new regulations, the new taxes. Agree to extend the Bush tax cuts. Don't raise taxes on capital and dividend investment. Lower them to get this economy going. Reassure consumers that we have a path to a balanced budget. Reassure businesses they won't be punished for hiring that new worker, bringing back that old worker, or hiring that new one, buying that new piece of equipment. Listen to the businesses around you who are telling you that you are the problem. This Washington Congress is the problem. Because the uncertainty, because the taxes, because of the extreme ideological agenda that is holding our economy back. Mr. President, if you want to turn this chart around, if you want to, and we'll help Democrats in Congress. We'll help you lower taxes. We'll help you take these items off the table. If you'll listen to our small businesses, listen to our energy workers, listen to our families. Because right now, most people in America believe this Washington is so arrogant, this Congress isn't listening, that they seem to know what's best for them, that they go any route, don't read any bills, rush massive measures through without any knowledge of what their impact is. And we learn months later that they're nothing like they're promised. And so average families are listening tonight. Workers are desperate for jobs. Yes, they see a Congress off on cap and trade and all sorts of schemes instead of encouraging the job creators to create more jobs. America cannot survive this job-killing agenda much longer. As strong as we are, as resilient as we are, as quick as we are to bounce back from recession, it's not happening this time. And Washington is the obstacle. Look in the mirror, congressional Democrats. President Obama, respectfully look in the mirror. And if you're serious about changing this economy, if you really want to answer the question, where are the jobs, we'll help you create those jobs where they belong, not in the government, but along Main Street, in every state, in every community in America. And by the way, it isn't enough anymore. The world has changed. It's not enough to just buy American. We have to sell American. We have to sell our products and services all throughout the world. But when we try to do that, what we find is a lot of countries have American need not apply sign. But Mr. President, you're not doing anything, or you're not doing enough to tear down those signs. Give us a chance to sell American goods and services. When we get a chance to compete, we win. We create jobs. We sell Americans successfully. But unfortunately, this Congress for 3 years has taken off the table any opportunity to go out and compete. And while we've voluntarily benched ourselves, the Democrats in Congress have stopped trade, while the President took a timeout, now starting to get step back, I think, a little more so. But while we voluntarily benched ourselves, other countries, China, Europe, Canada, and others, are stepping right around us, cutting agreements that create jobs and sell their products. And so U.S. farmers, U.S. businesses, U.S. Manufacturers, U.S. service companies, U.S. workers find themselves at a disadvantage because this White House, this Congress, is more interested in special interests than in the interests of our workers, of our economy, of our jobs. So tonight I would say respectfully to our Speaker of the House, to the Majority Leader of the Senate, President Obama, if you want an answer and a partner in creating jobs, Republicans are here. We have solutions. We're ready to fight for jobs, but we've got to tackle the debt. We've got to create incentives to create jobs. We've got to stop frightening consumers, frightening workers. And if we do that, America is capable of bouncing back and getting this economy on the right path again. Mr. President, work with us to get America strong again. With that, Mr. Speaker, I'd yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back the balance of his time.